Thank you very much indeed for coming to our Drupal 8 Day. This is the second of many detailed and hopefully interesting presentations that we have around Drupal 8 theming. I'm delighted to welcome Chaz from Forum 1. Chaz has done Drupal training videos, done Drupal books, and spends his time diving deep inside Drupal 8's theming system in his role at Forum 1. Chaz, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us today, and I'm going to pass things over to you.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate you having me present today. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you to the one-year anniversary of Drupal 8. A lot of great presentations you guys will be seeing today. I'm going to start off by talking about streamlined front-end development with PatternLab and Twig. So a little bit of housekeeping myself here. Little introduction of number one, who am I? My name is Chaz Chumley. I'm the technology manager in front-end development at Forum 1. You can follow me on Twitter at Chaz Chumley. I'm also the author of Drupal 8 Theming with Twig, which you can find at Amazon.com, as well as there'll be 2 more books that we're currently in the process of writing, Mastering Drupal 8 book and a Drupal 8 Blueprints. So make sure to keep an eye out for that as the year goes through. Another real quick housekeeping. Forum 1, who are we? Well, number one, we're a full-service digital agency. We craft solutions for the world's most influential organizations. The 3 things that stick out about Forum 1 is, number 1, we're very passionate. Number 2, we're very creative. And number 3, we're very strategic. The only reason I have a slide here regarding some of our clients is we have probably one of the best set of clients that I've had the luxury of working with, anywhere from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History, which we just finished their site, to Fairfax County Public Schools, which is the 9th largest school district. I'll be showing a couple of examples of those, which is why I bring that up as we dive deeper into PatternLab. So the agenda for the presentation is, I'm going to talk about, number 1, what is a pattern? How do you go about defining a pattern when you are looking at implementing a design and putting it into a theme? Once you've identified those patterns, how do we go about managing those? Why is using a tool such as PatternLab a very smart approach to managing patterns? The third item will be working with Twig. How do we actually take what we developed in PatternLab and actually how do those then kind of marry to each other with the implementation of PatternLab with Twig and Drupal 8 with Twig? And then finally, working smarter, where we're going to go from here once that we've got this kind of concept down. So to begin with, what is a pattern? There's many definitions for a pattern. The best one I've found is it is a generic solution that can be reused. So great, Chaz, what does that mean? What makes up a pattern? A pattern generally consists of 4 things. It consists of a name, and we all know naming is probably the most hard thing to actually do whenever you're doing any type of development. The second thing that a pattern does is it identifies and solves a problem that you're having, a design problem. The third thing that makes up a pattern is whatever you develop is reusable, as well as it's combinable to make larger patterns. So let's take a look at some common elements that we see on every single website that we develop. Excuse the obligatory kitten photos, we all love kittens, but this is an image. And we see many of images that are presented on the website or with different applications or in just everyday life. And so this is a simple pattern that consists of an image that can be reused. It can also be modified to various constraints, let's say for a hero image or a banner image. Yet it can be combined with other patterns to make something even more complex. Another example of a pattern that we commonly see and use, and this consists of a heading. So this can be reused and modified to display different variants, in this case H1 through H6s. Yet these can also be combined with other patterns to make something more complex. Another very simple pattern that we see when we're developing websites is a date. A simple pattern that consists of text that displays a date can also be reused, modified. We can have different date formats, but yet these can also be combined with other patterns to make something more complex. And then finally, another consistent pattern that we see is that of a paragraph. So a simple pattern that consists of text This can be reused across common typography. Yet we can also combine this with other patterns to make something more complex. So when we put these all together, we can see that patterns by themselves, while they can stand alone, can also be combined to make something a little bit more complex, in this case a card layout, and we've seen this all over the place. Common pattern to use to display a teaser content visually with an image, heading, date, and paragraph. But when reused across content, consists of smaller patterns that make up this card layout. We can then take that more complex pattern and combine those together as well. So we get multiple card layouts. So this is composite patterns that can be combined or duplicated to present multiple cards. And so whenever we're talking about Drupal, we're seeing this as a common design where we're aggregating or listing content and displaying it in a rich way that puts all these patterns together. So great. Now that we've identified these patterns, what is the best way about actually going and managing these patterns? How do we go about creating a library of components? Well, if you've been to DrupalCon or have caught Dries' keynotes, you've seen him mention Brad Frost's PatternLab and then this concept of atomic design principles. So PatternLab is really the best approach to managing these patterns. It helps you and your team build thoughtful, pattern-driven user interfaces using these principles. It's a concept of breaking down those common patterns into their smallest components so they can easily be reused and combined to make larger components. So let's take a look at an example of what we would consider to be atoms. In this case, a input box or a search button or a label. In this case, components that we might see when we're developing a search block. If we take those atoms and combine them all together, though, to create a molecule, we can actually see that search box coming into play and how those elements, when they're in the atom level, can be combined to make something that's a little bit more understandable to the end user. We can then take molecules and actually combine those with other molecules and atoms to create an organism. In this case, the header on a website that consists of a logo, menu items, and then again the search box. We can even take that up one more notch and create templates. So I can kind of think of this as a poor man's way of wireframing, but as you can see, we can start taking these organisms and molecules and atoms and start combining them together, whether they're standalone by themselves or whether they're being combined to make more complex patterns, so that we end up getting to a template layout, which then can be combined to make a page. So hopefully, if you're being able to identify these patterns, you're being able to understand how to manage these patterns using PatternLab. This whole concept of atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages makes a lot of sense to you. So PatternLab itself. A lot of times when you see presentations on Drupal 8 and PatternLab, they kind of do the magic cake, I call this. It's where you're not actually seeing how PatternLab number one is installed, how PatternLab is actually configured or ran. And so I've modified this presentation from the last time that me and Adam Duran, a colleague of mine, gave this at DrupalCon New Orleans to kind of walk you through this whole process. So at this time, demo gods willing, I'm actually going to jump out of the presentation here and actually go in and do a walkthrough of what PatternLab is. So here's an example of what PatternLab looks like, and this is going to be what our end-all result is going to be. You can think of PatternLab as a living style guide. It allows us to identify colors, fonts, different textual components, and at Forum 1, we've kind of modified this and created our own version of this, which lives inside of our theme layer. And so we have a theme for Drupal 7 as well as now Drupal 8 called Gesso that Corey Lafferty and Dan Millard created and maintained, that takes this Drupal 8 theme along with the ability to use a PatternLab starter kit to give you a really good basis to start with. So if I go ahead and flip over to my terminal window here, Here I have just a really basic install of Drupal 8. I've already pulled in the Gesso theme, and I'm listing the contents here so you can actually kind of get an idea of the structure here. We have our info file, our libraries YAML file, our theme file, our common CSS and images folder, an includes folder which has really minimal pre-processing functions that we've added, our JavaScript folder, SAS folder. We do use a JavaScript task runner. In this case, we use Grunt, but you can also easily use this with Gulp. So there is a little bit of an entry level. In order to be able to use PatternLab, you need to be somewhat familiar with NPM, node modules, and being able to at least understand what's going on with Grunt-based tasks. But the most simplest way, once you've actually downloaded Gesso and placed it inside your themes folder, is to run a composer command of composer create project PatternLab /addition Drupal standard PatternLab. If I go ahead and run this, this is actually going down and downloading the components that it needs to in order to pull in this version of PatternLab. It's running through creating the project, it's updating the composer dependencies that it's looking for, and then it's prompting us on whether or not we want to merge or replace. I'm going to go and simply say replace. The second part of this is there are starter kits that have been created. In this case, there's a starter kit Twig demo. There's a starter kit Twig Drupal minimal. Alexi Peebles, which actually was kind of the forefather of the approach that we're talking about with componentizing Drupal, has the Shiloh Drupal theme. And then we also have, Forum 1, have our own starter kit Twig Drupal theme for Gesso. So I can go ahead and specify that I want number 4. Let's go ahead and download that. I'll go ahead and replace what it's asking me to replace. And at this point, I actually have, as we can see here, a version of PatternLab. So the next thing that I need to do is actually build up my PatternLab install. So this time I'll run grunt Gesso build PatternLab. This is saying, oh, hold on real quick. Missed a step. npm install. This is where I said you need to have a barrier to actually understanding what's here. And so this npm install is looking actually at a package.json file, which is just pulling in the dependencies that PatternLab actually needs to be able to run properly. When that actually gets done installing those dependencies, at that point, then we can run the grunt command. All right. Now we can actually go ahead and run grunt Gesso build PatternLab. This is actually configuring PatternLab for us and running it. And with that, that's kind of the magic behind the scenes that a lot of times you don't get a chance to see. By all means, feel free to go back and review this video a little bit later to kind of slow down this process. And if you, by all means, have any questions on this after the presentation, you can go ahead and contact me directly either through Twitter or by reaching me at Forum 1. I'd be more than happy to share this information with you. All right, so now if I go ahead and flip back over to Drupal, I have my base Drupal install. And as we saw, the actual PatternLab and Gesso is inside of Gesso, which is inside our theme. So if I go over here and look at the path in the URL bar, I can actually see I'm inside my Drupal instance. I'm inside my themes Gesso PatternLab folder. And simply by saying public, I can actually go ahead and look at what comes out of the box with PatternLab. And so in this case, like I was stating before, this gives us a really good clean starting point to start with whenever we're taking any type of design and needing to implement it. And so far, haven't touched Drupal. This is kind of the ability for designs to be implemented by the front-end developers in such a way that they can run ahead of Drupal back-end developers, or they can run parallel with Drupal back-end developers, and making sure that the design gets implemented in PatternLab, and so that you have the straight-up static HTML, CSS, and any type of JavaScript interactivity that then a back-end developer can take a look at and actually implement using the Drupal 8 Twig templates. So let's take a real quick walkthrough of PatternLab itself. So again, like I said, out of the box, the atoms, molecules, organisms, we've kind of replaced those with something that's a little bit more based off of the block element modifying naming convention in Drupal. And so for our base, you can see we have things such as global variables for colors, fonts. Under text, we can see common HTML typography elements such as headings, paragraphs, block quotes, and the list goes down. And then once I actually start getting into components, we can see things like buttons, form items, navigational elements like our mobile menu, main menu, breadcrumbs, local tasks, so now we're starting to get into things that are more Drupal based. So this is all great. This is a starting point, but what does this actually look like out in the wild when you've actually had a full design handed to you and you need to implement this? So if I go back over to the Fairfax County Public Schools, which is a project that we currently finished their central site and are working on 190 school sites, this is what the style guide or PatternLab components that we developed for this based off the design look like. So you can see our colors have changed. Our fonts have changed. We're specifying the actual fonts that we're using. Our headings based off of those font families and those font sizes, different paragraphs. But where this really comes into play is when you start looking at how these components come together. So if I go take a look in this case at sections and I go look at a section callout, here's a simple pattern that we've identified, and we see this commonly throughout websites. It's a simple callout that has a title. It also has a button, and then when we're able to develop these, we can develop them in such a way that the markup in here, since you're utilizing Drupal 8 Twig, can actually be utilized also over in Drupal using some different, whether it's a custom block or whether it's actually a paragraph bundle for those familiar with paragraphs. And so we can actually take this pattern and actually move it in there. So let me actually go ahead and open up my editor here and take a look at what the structure looks like with PatternLab. So here we have the PatternLab folder, and once again, it's inside our themes Gesso folder, and this is for the Fairfax County Public Schools website. And inside of PatternLab, we have a source folder and then our patterns. And so base, components, blocks, sections, etc. We saw those on the front end. This is what the back end folder structure looks like. In this case, we're looking at sections and we're looking at that section callout. And so we can see the markup here is pretty straightforward. Okay. A simple div with some layout constraint classes wrapped around it, a section element with some classes for identifying it's a callout, so for being able to change the background color of the callout, and then we have the text and we have the button. So actually, how does this correlate from PatternLab over to Drupal? Well, the light bulb really went on when PatternLab was able to start utilizing Twig, because out of the box, Drupal 8 utilizes Twig, and so you have this common marriage between a way to manage your component library and the way that Drupal is able to utilize templates and markup to display the presentational layer for it. And so when we came to the realization, oh wait, PatternLab's using Twig and Drupal 8's using Twig, how can we get these two to talk to each other? And so we were able to take a look at the markup here for the callout, and then if I go over to a Drupal template, in this case using the paragraph components, which we'll take a look at here in a second, and I flip over here, though, you can see the markup here is almost dead on identical. The only thing that's really changing here in this is the fact that we have some data attributes coming from a JSON file for PatternLab, and over here in Drupal, we're just replacing those static JSON variables with Drupal's content variable and printing out the field heading and the field link for the section text and the section button. So when Paragraphs module came around in Drupal 7, and especially Drupal 8, this allowed us to be able to take a look at being able to build these components very easily and actually have them kind of almost identically match what we were building as far as components in PatternLab. So here you can see an example of a callout being actually used, and if I go take a look at the paragraph types for this, I can see that I actually have a callout one up here, where if I go to click on Manage Fields, I can see that it has two fields. It has a field for the heading, and it has a field for the link. And again, those correlate right back to what we're seeing here inside of both PatternLab for the section text and the section button, and then the ability to create a paragraph template based off that paragraph bundle to, again, be able to print out the section text and the section button. So it makes this correlation between PatternLab and Drupal 8 just a natural tendency to be able to work with. So being able to combine those two tools together, was really smart, and it allowed us to start thinking of different ways to be able to work smarter. And so, where do we go from here when we talk about working smarter? One thing you may not know or be aware of is that, if I go ahead and close this real quick so you can see a closer look at the folder structure here, is because of the fact that our PatternLab and our Twig files live inside of Gesso, we have the ability to kind of extend this by utilizing a different approach to actually having Drupal, its Twig templates itself, talk to PatternLab Twig templates. Not going to go into that level of detail today. There's going to be some other presentations that will. But the one thing that people, is kind of a misnomer, is the Twig templates for Drupal 8 have to reside inside of a templates folder. That's not the case. In fact, the only thing really keeping, at this point, Drupal 8's version of Twig, which I say its version of Twig because it uses .html.twig, and the version of straight up Twig that PatternLab uses, the only thing that's keeping those two from really being able to talk to each other is something is referred to as Twig namespacing. But we do see that because of the fact that PatternLab does live inside of Gesso, and the fact that Drupal 8 doesn't really care where its Twig templates are located, we could actually start to decouple this approach. And this is more of an advanced concept, and this is something that allows us to be able to look at utilizing something such as component libraries. And this is something that in Drupal 8, John Albin, when he asked the question, why are we doing this approach, came to a conclusion that the only thing stopping Drupal 8 from being able to actually talk to straight up Twig was this concept of Twig namespaces. So if you're not familiar with the component libraries module that John Albin created, this allows us to be able to register those Twig namespaces in such a way that we can then extend additional HTML.twig templates, but even take it up one more notch and be able to include straight up .twig templates inside of our Drupal 8 instance. So that's great, Chaz. What does that give us the ability to do? While this particular theme here doesn't have that, or it doesn't use that approach, what it would allow us to do is in, say, for instance, block footer. I'm just printing out the content, but I could actually straight up include in here a pointer or a reference back over to PatternLab, to our source, and then over to our patterns, and be able to pull in stuff like in our navigation, like our actual footer menu. And so this markup here would actually be being called from Drupal itself, and so that this kind of, I'm going to show my age here, but the Ronco-matic, the whole set it and forget it concept, what that allow us to be able to start doing, and there's some great examples of this, is have PatternLab be the canonical source for all of our layout, for our patterns, for our markup, for our design, so that Drupal is actually referencing PatternLab instead of the concept of building it in PatternLab and then turning around and copying and pasting it back over into a templates folder with the markup as we see here. There's still a correlation, there's still a one-to-one, but being able to eliminate that step completely by utilizing this component libraries that John Albin created. And so that would be an example of working smarter. But the question remains is, where do we go from here? Speaking at the Drupal front-end summit at Bandcamp in October, I brought up this question, and I grabbed a panel of smarter people than me, let's say, together, Morton, Scott Reeves, and other folks that were working on the and maintaining Drupal 8's front end. And I asked this question, so where are we going from here? And so we've heard thrown around this whole concept of decoupled Drupal. And there's great examples by Media Current with decoupled blocks. There's great examples by Red Hat and Kendall Totten, who's takes this approach and kind of puts it on steroids, but is doing it in Drupal 7, which is very awesome, and taking the approach of actually having the patterns feed Drupal, utilizing Micah Godbolt's MVC framework. There was talks of even decoupling Drupal even more, and where this is going to fall in the line of things, whether it's Drupal 9 or if it's Drupal 8.5 or 8.6, but having this concept of having Drupal's theming layer be decoupled in such a manner that the HTML.twig templates don't really care where it's getting its content from. So having kind of this bridge between that, which then really makes the decoupled Drupal approach be even more powerful. And so those are all things that are currently being talked about in the Drupal 8 theming roadmap. But things that you'll definitely want to take a look at are some additional sessions that are coming up today. One's with Drupal 8 flexible page layouts and elements using paragraphs. It'll go a little bit deeper dive into this concept of paragraphs, because what we're really seeing with utilizing paragraphs is this really flat banded approach. So just looking at the page layout here, for example, this is a single node, and it's using paragraphs to manage the hero. It's using it to manage introductory text. It's using it to be able to do embedding, in this case, a Google Calendar. It's allowing to have a two-up call-out and then single call-outs. So this whole flat-banded approach where you have a single node which just has bands going across a page that have different design elements, that really is a powerful approach and a common practice that we're seeing by being able to utilize these paragraph module. Another great presentation, hopefully you can make today, is this component-driven Drupal theming, and then obviously building Drupal sites with components. The other thing you can do is really start to get involved. So you can actually take a look at PatternLab itself by going directly to the URL and playing around with it. There is also a PatternLab chat room at Getter, which allows you to be able to really interact and network with folks that are using PatternLab, being able to ask the questions and being able to voice concerns or any issues that you're having, being able to implement or work with it. Again, take a look at the Gesto theme as well. The project for this is at Drupal.org, and then also you can go to GitHub for Dan Muard to actually look at the PatternLab PHP version of Gesto, as well as the starter kit Twig. And then resources. Where do we go from here? I looked at the component libraries module that John Albin created, but there's also a great series by Four Kitchens on component-based theming in Drupal 8. I'll leave the slide up here if anybody's trying to copy this and look at it right now, but these slides will be available. The component-based theming series in Drupal 8 that Four Kitchens does is going to walk you through a 4-series process of actually utilizing and implementing the component libraries that I talked about, and actually being able to kick this up a notch from which the current install of PatternLab and current use of PatternLab is being done. So definitely that's worth taking a look at. Also, I won't have the personal luxury of going to Athens, Greece, but on the 26th and 27th of May is Front End United, and this is all things front end related. So this would be something for you to take a look at if you also really want to get involved. With that, I know I kind of went through this fast, but I find that when I give this presentation, I have a lot more questions that generally come up. So I want to actually go ahead and open up this time for any questions, any specific questions regarding PatternLab, its use, any edge cases or use cases that you're looking at wanting to be able to implement this. I'll be more than happy to field those questions at this time.
Sure thing, Chaz. We got a question from Danny. How does Drupal know via components to exclude hard-coded markup when pointing to a PatternLab file?
Okay, so that'd be the concept of really of how, when you're using the component libraries module for that to come into play. Because as you can see from the examples I have here, if I go take a look back at the sections and the section callout, this is only in PatternLab at this point. This is a section callout.twig file, and so this only lives in PatternLab at this point. And so if I go flip back over to the call it itself, which we're seeing here, at this point, while this PatternLab lives inside the theme inside of Drupal, Drupal isn't aware of this until you actually go and then figure out how you want to develop this callout. And so that's where paragraphs module came into play. And if you've done any type of theming in Twig, you realize that there's generally Twig templates almost for anything that you want to use. And so the paragraphs folder here has a list of all the different paragraph templates. And so the paragraph callout one up, literally all that took place was we copied this, pasted it into this template, and then replaced the static variables that JSON was feeding PatternLab to actually have some content show with the dynamic variables. So kicking that up a notch, to answer Danny's question there, utilizing the component libraries module, you would be able to, first, number one, you'd have to create a namespace that says, hey, Drupal, I can point to my PatternLab folder here as a namespace, and then you'd be able to utilize something like an include and pass the content field heading and content field link up to it. I believe there's an example here of the include, and the include also though allows you to be able to do an extend as well as also being in the include to be able to utilize a with attributes and pass those variables up to PatternLab itself. And so this markup in the paragraph template then would disappear and you'd be calling PatternLab directly. And so it actually would be outputting this markup over on the Drupal 8 side.
Cool. One question which is more about Drupal 8 in general. When it comes to installing the dependencies, modules, and themes and so on, is there any way or any thoughts about using npm instead of Composer, or does everything run through Composer in Drupal 8?
So I'll answer that two different ways. One is, and let me actually go ahead and open up a Composer-based install of Drupal here real quick. This is another project that we're currently working on, and if I go ahead and pull this up, you will see our composer.json files here. So speaking from Drupal itself first, the recommended approach moving forward on Drupal 8 projects would be for you to look at implementing a composer-based install at Drupal. And similar to what npm, where you have a package.json file, Composer has its own JSON file that allows you to specify, in this case here with requires, specific modules that you want to be able to pull in, as well as what versions of those. The nice thing about a composer-based approach with Drupal 8 and managing these modules and dependencies is that, number one, you can specify the versions you want. You can be able to then run things like Composer update to get the latest versions. You can also specify, if you scroll down a little bit, installer path, so you can actually specify that these automatically get pulled into web modules contrib or web profiles contrib for anything that might be profile related, or even web libraries. So if you're pulling in, the chosen or the select JavaScript dependencies for whatever those modules are. Or if you take the approach of speaking of PatternLab in general and utilizing it inside of a theme, we do manage it from an npm approach with being able to use a package.json file, which is what we're seeing here. And you can see it's very similar in nature to composer.json, but here we're saying, okay, this package is for the Gesso theme. It has dependencies on Grunt, some different things for doing SVGs to PNG conversion, Sass globbing, post CSS to do auto prefixing, and any other additional tasks that we've set up inside of our tasks folder. So those are, I don't say that I wouldn't necessarily say that. In fact, I'm not even positive that you could actually use npm to actually run a Drupal instance. Composer is definitely the approach you can want to go. In fact, again, that's been the direction by the Drupal community and the Drupal organization, is to start going to this more composer-based approach for Drupal. And then package.json, whether you're using Grunt task as a task runner or Gulp, you're going to be utilizing npm more than likely, and so you're going to want to manage your theming dependencies utilizing this approach. Any other questions?
Yes, got one more for you, Chaz. With PatternLab and paragraphs, it seems as if you would not need display suite anymore. Does this approach actually remove the need for display suite in favor of exact control over your templating?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And so one of the things coming from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 is this tendency to over-architect a Drupal 8 site from a site building perspective, because in Drupal 7 we were really forced to kind of put the square peg in the round hole, and the only way to really do that was utilizing things like display suite to manage view modes, to manage fields, to add, take the CSS that we had over in our design and kind of force feed Drupal it so that actually the markup and the CSS work together. We also in Drupal 7 had to worry about utilizing Page Manager and Panelizer, and while there's still use cases for those, I would probably say that 95% of the Drupal 8 projects that you'd be working on, you don't need Display Suite anymore, you don't need Page Manager, you don't need Panelizer, and the reason for that is Core out of the box gives you the ability to create, number one, display modes. So under structure display modes, under view modes, you have the ability to specify these additional displays that a particular content type can utilize. That was something that we really relied on Display Suite for. Now that that's been moved into Core, there is no really concern to be able to use Display Suite or even install Display Suite. And then with the implementation of how paragraph types are used, we have the ability to create these components, whether it's an announcement list or even really other cool stuff like block embed and view embed, because everything in Drupal 8 is a block. And so this whole concept of like panelizing it really doesn't make sense to do anymore, because the fact that it's already come core out of the box allows you to have everything as a block. You can reuse blocks. Blocks are fieldable. And so another cool thing, because let me show this to you real quick since we have time, there's a great module if you're doing any type of Twig development called Twig Tweaks. And I'd say this should be part of anybody's arsenal when they're doing any type of Drupal development, because what it allows you to do is actually embed views, embed blocks, embed entities, and actually embed fields and configuration stuff that you normally probably would have done utilizing Panelizer and dropping things on the page. You can now do these directly in the Twig template by utilizing these. And so what this really allows you to do, combined with paragraphs, is do something like a block embed or even a view embed, to where I can go manage the fields on this real quick. I'll show you. This is just an entity reference to all of the blocks. And so if I go to actually take a look at the block names, I can see a listing of all the blocks that this particular site has. And so I can combine this field along with a paragraph type to be able to do something like, let me check, make sure, create a single paragraph or a single field type that references all these paragraph types, in this case page content. So if I click on this, you can see this is just an entity reference revision to paragraph types, and then I can specify all of these paragraph types that I built out, which are these standalone entities, which ones I want to actually use when a user can build out this page. So in this case, a basic page, if I say content, add content basic page, it really minimizes the actual layout of this. All I need to build that basically all I really need to do is give it a title, which is obviously required. If this page needs to have a hero go across, I can actually add a hero. But I can start doing things like add a block embed, which then just gives the user ability to say, you know what, I want to display, I don't know, let's say the page title again. But you can see here with those other paragraph types, I can also call my callouts, I can call form embeds, I can call full text, which is just pulls in a WYSIWYG. This allows me to have this flat-banded approach to content, and it's paragraphs and PatternLab have this natural tendency of being able to, hey, I'm building the component inside of PatternLab. It correlates back over to the same way I can build it out using paragraphs, and then I can actually add these paragraphs to my content types, which gives the user the flexibility of adding whatever they want on the page and building out the page, but then also being able to reorder these items on the page. And so those were things, that in Drupal 7, maybe if you were using PageRank Panelizer, they'd have to edit the page, drag things around the page. With this approach, they're working straight from the node add edit screen, which is something that all site builders and clients are very comfortable with using. But it gives us the ability to, do some really powerful types of pages. Let's go look at another example here real quick. A basic page. We'll go look at the attendance form, and we'll look at college resources. So the attendance form has the hero, has a title, it has the description across, and then this actually has a form in here and all this is being added using paragraph types. I have the college resources page, which has a video embed on it, or in this case a slide embed with some additional content. And so if we actually go take a look at editing this page that had the form embed on it, this is just using a straight up paragraph type again for the form embed, and allows me to specify any forms that are here. And this again is going a little bit in the weeds, but this is using YAML forms, which is the #1 replacement for what you may have used web forms for in Drupal 7. But you can see with this flat-banded approach using paragraphs and componentizing things, I really can be really flexible in building out these pages.
Okay, one quick question here. Is there a minimum version of Node.js needed to install the Gesso template?
That's a great question. I'm getting in the weeds again, but I do not think so. I would say go ahead and try it, and if you run into any challenges or issues with that, you can actually go ahead and contact us directly, or actually contact Dan Mouillard or Corey Lafferty, or file an issue over on the Drupal.org with the Gesso, and we'd be more than happy to make sure that we either add some additional documentation that specifies if there is a required minimal version of that, as well as if you run into any issues using the Gesso and PatternLab. Obviously, we maintain all the issues here and respond to people as fast as possible.
Great, and the final question, it looks like, can you talk about using PatternLab as a living style guide?
Yes. So if I go back over to the particular schools one, and we take a look at it. So this is probably the most advantageous reason of using PatternLab. If you take Drupal completely out of the picture, let's say you could be using Drupal, you could be using WordPress, you could be using Django, you could be using Jekyll. It's PatternLab doesn't have a dependency on anything. It's dependency agnostic. It can be set up for building a static website, but it acts as a living style guide from the standpoint of a designer, whether you're the designer or whether you're working with a team that has a designer. The designer can go ahead and build something using tools like Webflow, which is allows us to be able to build out pages that this is all for design purposes only, but then turn around and start identifying the components with something like this, and start dropping those back over into PatternLab. So it gives us the ability to identify the colors, again, the ability to identify the fonts that are being used. And the reason I say this is a living style guide is because, number one, this lives inside the theme, so it's always accessible to the client. And the client in the workflow that generally we take place is we'll actually have them go and take a look at this prior to us even building these components out, and whether it's Drupal, WordPress, Django, any other thing you can possibly think of that's a content management system, or even a static website. We'll allow them to actually take a look at this, and there is a feature here that actually it's turned off right now that tells you the state that each of these items are in, and it's either in progress or in review or approved, and so you have a little indicator next to these. So that gives us the ability to know what the client has signed off on. The other nice thing about PatternLab as being a living style guide is I can do things such as this. So if I go look at, I don't know, the basic page layout for this, I can actually look to see what this would look like on a large screen, on a mobile screen, on a small device, or if I really want to get crazy, I can go for full disco mode. But it allows the client to actually see how this is going to interact with their site before we actually start building it out. And so this allows us to actually have this as, you know, a place that the client can always go back and look at. Any other developers that might inherit this once this project goes into support, they can go back and look at this. And it allows front-end developers to quickly jump back in on the project and go through different phases of the project or different iterations of the design inside of PatternLab first, and then actually, once the client signed off on it, have it be implemented over in whatever platform you're building this for.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chaz. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for presenting today.
Yep, no problem. I really appreciate you having me today, Steve. Again, make sure you go and take a look at some of the other upcoming presentations that are taking place today on theming, whether it's component-based or utilizing paragraphs, because those are definitely something that if you are new to front-end development, or if you're coming from Drupal 7, are things you're going to want to add to your Drupal tool build.
Great, and thank you guys for attending. We hope to see more of you later today. We've got some similar topics, as Chaz mentioned, and I hope you enjoy Drupal 8 Day. Thank you.